morning light filtered through the courthouse windows, with cruel indifference, as Sarah Mitchell pressed her palm against her swollen belly, 8 months of life stirring within her. The marble floors echoed with the footsteps of strangers rushing to their own private catastrophes, but none carried the weight of what she was about to face. Her breathing came in measured intervals, a technique she'd learned not from prenatal classes but from years of managing panic under Richard's roof. The divorce papers in her leather portfolio felt heavier than the child she carried. She saw him before he saw her. Richard Mitchell entered the courthouse like he owned it. His charcoal suit impeccable. His stride confident. But it wasn't his presence that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. It was the woman on his arm. Madison Cross, 23 years old with platinum hair and a scarlet dress that mocked the solemnity of the proceedings. They moved through the corridor as if attending a premiere, Madison's laugh tinkling like broken glass against the austere walls. When Richard's eyes finally found Sarah, his smile was the same one he'd worn the night he'd first told her she was imagining things, that the perfume on his collar was nothing, that she was being hormonal and irrational. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had imagined, more intimate in its capacity for destruction. Judge Patricia Winters presided with tired eyes that had seen too many marriages dissolve into acrimony. Sarah's attorney, Rebecca Taylor, squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture meant to ground her. But Sarah felt herself floating somewhere above her body, watching the scene unfold. Like a film she couldn't pause. "Your Honor." Richard's attorney, James Bradley, began with practiced authority. "My client has been more than generous in his settlement offer, considering Mrs. Mitchell's limited contribution to the marital assets." The words stung exactly as intended. Sarah had given up her marketing career at Richard's insistence, had become the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinners, managing households, being invisible when required, and radiant when useful. Rebecca's response was swift and factual, outlining Sarah's sacrifices, her non-monetary contributions, the systematic financial abuse that had left her dependent. But it was Madison who broke protocol, her voice cutting through the legal proceedings like a blade. "She's pathetic," Madison said, loud enough for everyone to hear, clinging to a man who doesn't want her, using that baby as a trap. The room seemed to inhale collectively, Judge Winters' gavel raised in warning, but Madison was already standing, moving towards Sarah with predatory grace. "You think you're some kind of victim? You're just a weak woman who couldn't keep her husband satisfied." Sarah's hands protectively cradled her belly. "You don't know anything about our marriage." The slap came without warning. Madison's palm connected with Sarah's cheek with such force that the sound ricocheted off the walls like a gunshot. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face, and then she felt the warm rush of fluid down her legs, the sudden, crushing pressure in her abdomen. "My water," she gasped, gripping the edge of the table. "The baby." Chows erupted. Rebecca was instantly at her side while the bailiff moved to restrain Madison, who stood frozen, her hand still raised, the reality of what she'd done slowly registering on her face. Richard remained seated, his expression unreadable, as if calculating the optics of the situation rather than showing concern for his unborn child. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. Sarah's legs buckled, and she found herself on the cold floor, Rebecca's jacket bunched under her head. The contractions came like waves, too early, too fast, while above her, voices argued about liability and assault charges. Through the pain, she heard Madison's shrill protests, Richard's measured attempts at damage control, and somewhere distant, the sound of sirens approaching. Judge Winters' voice cut through the noise with absolute authority. "Clear this courtroom immediately. Miss Cross, you're under arrest for assault. Mr. Mitchell, sit down." But Sarah heard it all, as if through water, her world narrowing to the rhythm of her breathing, and the desperate prayer that her baby would survive what her marriage had not. Their love story had begun like all the others that end in courtrooms with promises that felt like prophecy. Sarah had been 26, working at Preston Marketing, when Richard Mitchell walked into a client presentation. He was everything her mother Helen had warned her about, and everything her younger self had craved. Powerful. Charming. 11 years older, with silver threading through his temples like earned wisdom. He pursued her with the intensity of a man who always got what he wanted, sending flowers to her desk daily, each bouquet more elaborate than the last. "You're different," he'd told her over dinner at La Bernardine, his hand covering hers across the white tablecloth. You have substance. These other women, they're all surface. She'd believed him because believing felt like being chosen for something greater than her ordinary life. The wedding had been featured in lifestyle magazines, 500 guests at the Breakers in Palm Beach, her dress a cloud of French lace, Richard's smile perfectly calibrated for every photograph. Her mother, Helen, had sat in the front row, her expression carefully neutral, though Sarah had caught the worry in her eyes during the father-daughter dance she'd shared with the stepfather, who'd raised her after her biological father's abandonment. The isolation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. First, it was the job. Why would you want to work? Richard had asked, genuinely puzzled. I make more in a month than you make in a year. Besides, I need you at home, supporting my career. Then came the friends, too dramatic, too single, too influential. Her gym membership was excessive when they had a home gym. Her book club was gossipy women with nothing better to do. Even her mother's visits became a source of tension. She undermines us, Richard would say after Helen left. She puts ideas in your head. The financial control was surgical in its precision. Credit cards were monitored, purchases questioned. She had an allowance generous by most standards, humiliating by the reality of having to ask permission to buy a winter coat. Richard would sit at his mahogany desk, reviewing her receipts like a forensic accountant, questioning a coffee purchase here, a pharmacy run there. I'm not controlling, he'd say, his tone patient as if explaining to a child. I'm protective. You don't understand how people would take advantage of you if I wasn't careful. The gaslighting was an art form. When she'd found a receipt for jewelry she'd never received, Richard convinced her she'd forgotten their anniversary gift, that her pregnancy brain was making her paranoid. When she smelled perfume on his clothes, he'd spent an hour explaining how his secretary had spilled her bottle in his office, how the scent had permeated everything. He was so convincing that Sarah found herself apologizing for doubting him. The discovery came through banality. Richard's tablet left open on the kitchen counter, messages syncing automatically. The conversations with Madison were explicit, cruel in their casual dismissal of Sarah. My wife is a ghost, he'd written. I stay for appearances. The pregnancy was her last desperate attempt to matter. Madison's responses were worse, planning their future while Sarah grew their child. After the divorce, we'll renovate the Hamptons house. I've always hated her taste so suburban. Sarah had photographed everything, her hands shaking as she documented the death of her delusions. But it was the final message that broke something fundamental inside her. Had Sarah been stronger, maybe I could have loved her. Weak women invite betrayal. Her mother had been dead 6 months by then. A sudden heart attack that Richard had barely acknowledged beyond the funeral arrangements. Standing in her childhood home, surrounded by Helen's things, Sarah had found her mother's journal. The entries from before Sarah's birth revealed a truth that had been buried for decades. Helen's affair with a young attorney named Thomas Patterson, the pregnancy that ended the affair, the decision to raise Sarah alone rather than destroy his marriage. I want my daughter to be stronger than I was, Helen had written, to never accept less than complete devotion. The decision to divorce wasn't courage, it was survival. The baby deserved better than growing up in a museum of pretense. Sarah deserved better than being a ghost in her own life. She'd hired Rebecca Taylor on the recommendation of a woman at her obstetrician's office, someone who'd noticed the careful way Sarah explained away bruises that weren't physical, but might as well have been. Now, lying on the courtroom floor, feeling her child fighting to enter a world already marked by violence, Sarah wondered if strength was simply enduring until you couldn't anymore, then finding a way to endure anyway. The woman who knelt beside Sarah in the courthouse corridor had the kind of presence that made security guards step back instinctively. Emma Patterson was 28, with auburn hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that held the same green intensity Sarah saw in her own mirror. Her suit was department store bought, but worn with the confidence of couture, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought for every syllable of respect. Don't try to sit up, Emma commanded, her hand gentle despite her firm tone. I'm an attorney here. I saw what happened. That woman assaulted you, and I've already asked court security to preserve the footage. Sarah's vision blurred with pain and tears. The baby's coming. It's too early. 34 weeks isn't too early anymore, Emma said, though her jaw tightened with concern. The paramedics are 2 minutes out. Just breathe with me. Okay? In through your nose, out through your mouth. Madison's voice shrilled from somewhere behind them. I barely touched her. She's being dramatic. Emma stood in one fluid motion, positioning herself between Madison and Sarah like a wall. Miss Cross, I'd advise you to stop talking immediately. Anything you say can and will be used against you, in both criminal and civil proceedings. Assault on a pregnant woman causing premature labor? You're looking at felony charges, not to mention the civil lawsuit that will bankrupt you. You don't even know her, Madison spat. But uncertainty crept into her voice. Emma's smile was sharp as winter. I know enough. I know she's a woman in crisis who was attacked in a place where she should have been safe. I know you're about to become very familiar with the inside of a jail cell. And I know that if you take one more step toward her, I'll personally ensure you're charged with attempted murder of an unborn child. The threat hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Madison retreated, and Emma returned to Sarah's side, her expression softening. You're going to be okay, she said, and something in her voice made Sarah believe it, even as another contraction ripped through her body. The paramedics arrived in a rush of efficiency, transferring Sarah to a stretcher with practiced care. Emma gathered Sarah's belongings without being asked, her movements quick and purposeful. I'm coming with you, she announced to the paramedics, who didn't argue. In the ambulance, between the oxygen mask and the IV line, Sarah studied Emma's profile. There was something familiar about the set of her jaw, the way she held her head when concentrating. Why? Sarah managed to ask. Why are you helping me? Emma was quiet for a long moment, watching the heart monitor track the baby's vitals. Because someone should have helped my mother, she finally said. Because women like Madison Cross think they can destroy lives without consequences. Because she paused, seeming to weigh her words. Because sometimes family shows up in unexpected ways. The word family hung between them, loaded with meaning Sarah couldn't quite grasp through the haze of pain. Emma's hand found hers, squeezing gently. There's something I should tell you, but not now. After the baby's safe. After you're both safe. At the hospital, Emma became Sarah's fierce advocate, cutting through bureaucracy with surgical precision. When the nurses hesitated about letting her stay, Emma produced a power of attorney form from her briefcase. Miss Mitchell signed this in the ambulance, she said smoothly, though Sarah had no memory of signing anything. I'm her legal representative and healthcare proxy. Dr. Holbrook arrived like cavalry, her presence immediately calming. Sarah, I know this isn't how we planned, but your baby's heart rate is strong. We're going to take good care of both of you. She glanced at Emma. Yes, Emma said without hesitation, and Sarah was too exhausted to correct her. As they wheeled Sarah toward delivery, Emma leaned close. Your mother was Helen Parker before she married, she whispered. Thomas Patterson was my father. He was also yours. The revelation should have been shocking, but somehow, in that moment of raw vulnerability, it felt like pieces of a puzzle, finally clicking into place. The father who'd abandoned her before birth, the successful attorney her mother never spoke of, the child from his marriage who would have been raised with everything Sarah had lacked. Half-sisters. Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her. Emma nodded, tears finally breaking through her professional composure. I've known for 3 years. I've wanted to contact you so many times, but I didn't know how. Then I saw you today in that courtroom, saw what that woman did to you, and I couldn't stand by anymore. I couldn't let you go through this alone. The courtroom had been reconfigured by the time the divorce proceedings resumed 3 days later. Sarah's absence was palpable. She remained at the hospital with newborn William, born at 4 pounds but breathing on his own, a fighter like his mother. Emma Patterson sat in Sarah's place, armed with medical documentation and a barely contained fury that made even seasoned court officers nervous. Judge Patricia Winters had denied Richard's motion for postponement with prejudice. Mr. Mitchell, your mistress's assault on your pregnant wife resulted in premature labor. The fact that you're inconvenienced by your wife's medical absence is a consequence of your own choices. Rebecca Taylor stood with renewed vigor, her case strengthened by the publicity nightmare that had erupted. Your Honor, in light of recent events, we're amending our petition. We're seeking full custody, supervised visitation only for Mr. Mitchell, and a restraining order against Madison Cross. James Bradley, Richard's attorney, looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days. Your Honor, my client cannot be held responsible for Miss Cross's independent actions. Independent? Rebecca's laugh was bitter. We have text messages between Mr. Mitchell and Miss Cross from that morning, planning to put Sarah in her place during the proceedings. Would you like me to read them aloud? Richard's composure finally cracked. Those were taken out of context. Silence, Mr. Mitchell. Judge Winters commanded. Miss Taylor. Proceed. Rebecca pulled up the messages on her tablet, her voice steady as she read. Make sure Sarah sees you with me. I want her to understand she's been replaced. That's from Mr. Mitchell. Sent at 7:43 a.m. Miss Cross responded. Don't worry, baby. I'll make sure she knows she's nothing. Emma watched Richard's face cycle through emotions, anger, calculation, a brief flash of what might have been regret but was probably just strategic reassessment. She'd seen that expression before on her father's face, the look of a man who'd never faced real consequences suddenly realizing the bill had come due. Furthermore, Rebecca continued, we've discovered that Mr. Mitchell has been systematically hiding assets, offshore accounts in the Caymans, property transfers to shell companies, a pattern of financial abuse that goes back years. Objection, Bradley said weakly. We haven't been provided with this evidence. Because we just received it this morning, Rebecca said smoothly, from a whistleblower at Mr. Mitchell's firm. Someone who was apparently moved by seeing a pregnant woman assaulted in a courthouse. The proceedings grew more damning with each revelation. Madison, out on bail but facing assault charges, had been dropped by Richard faster than a bad stock. Her desperate attempts to contact him had been met with a cease and desist letter from his attorney. The woman who'd strutted into court on his arm was now radioactive, and Richard was nothing if not pragmatic about cutting losses. Emma watched it all with the detached interest of someone studying a cautionary tale. She'd grown up with a different version of Richard Mitchell Thomas Patterson, respected judge, distant father, man who'd chosen his reputation over acknowledging his firstborn daughter. But watching Richard now, she saw the same fundamental cowardice, the same willingness to destroy rather than accept responsibility. Your Honor, Rebecca said, we'd like to present evidence that this is not Mr. Mitchell's first act of domestic violence. The courtroom went silent. Richard's face drained of color. That's a lie. Mr. Mitchell's second wife, Catherine Wells, filed 2 police reports before her untimely death in what was ruled an accidental overdose. We've been contacted by her sister, who has recordings of Catherine describing systematic abuse, gaslighting, and threats. She's willing to testify. Emma felt her phone vibrate a text from the hospital. Sarah had sent a photo of William, tiny but perfect, his small fist wrapped around her finger. Fighting for both of us, the message read. Emma smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced since learning about her father's secret. Hope for what family could be when built on truth rather than lies. Judge Winters called a recess. But the damage was done. Richard's carefully constructed image was crumbling, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Emma stood, straightening her suit, and walked past Richard without acknowledgement. She had a nephew to meet and a sister to support. The rest, the trials, the accusations, the final unraveling of Richard Mitchell would happen with or without her presence. But Sarah wouldn't face any of it alone again. The neonatal intensive care unit hummed with the quiet urgency of machines keeping fragile lives tethered to the world. Sarah sat in a rocking chair beside William's incubator, her hand resting on the clear plastic, as close to touching him as the tubes and wires would allow. He was so small, this warrior child who'd entered the world through violence but somehow remained untouched by it, his face peaceful in artificial sleep. Dr. Caroline Holbrook moved through her rounds with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to balance clinical precision with human compassion. She'd been Sarah's obstetrician for 6 months, one of the few medical professionals Richard hadn't managed to alienate or control. Now she stood beside Sarah, checking William's charts with satisfaction. His oxygen levels are improving every hour, she said softly. He's a fighter. Gets that from his mother. Sarah's laugh was hollow. I don't feel like much of a fighter. I feel like someone who got hit and fell down. You got back up, Dr. Holbrook reminded her. That's what fighters do. Emma arrived with coffee and a change of clothes for Sarah, moving through the NICU with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she chose to be. She'd been there every day, sometimes for hours, learning William's feeding schedule, consulting with specialists, ensuring Sarah never had to ask for anything twice. Rebecca called. Emma said quietly, settling into the chair beside Sarah. Madison's been officially charged. The security footage was crystal clear, and 3 court officers gave statements. She's looking at minimum 2 years. Possibly 5. Sarah's hand trembled against the incubator. And Richard? Still trying to salvage his reputation. But there's more. Emma hesitated, then pulled out her phone. Madison called me from jail. She wants to make a deal. The recording was poor quality, Madison's voice thin and desperate through the jail phone. I know things about Richard. About Catherine. It wasn't an accident. He planned it. Made it look like an overdose. I have recordings. Conversations where he laughed about it. He said if he could get rid of one wife, he could get rid of another. Sarah's blood chilled. She'd suspected, somewhere deep in her bones, that Catherine's death hadn't been the tragedy Richard portrayed. But hearing it confirmed, hearing Madison's casual admission of knowledge she'd sat on while planning her own future with a murderer, it was almost too much. She's willing to testify, Emma continued. In exchange for a plea deal, the DA's interested. Sarah looked at William, at his tiny chest rising and falling with determined breaths. He killed her. He actually killed her. We don't know for certain yet, Emma said carefully, though her expression suggested otherwise. But Madison's recordings, if they exist, could prove it. Dr. Holbrook, who'd been pretending not to listen, finally spoke. I treated Catherine Wells. Twice. She came in with injuries that didn't match her explanations. I documented everything. Reported it to the appropriate authorities. Nothing was done. Her voice carried years of frustration. Rich men don't face consequences unless someone forces them to. A knock on the door interrupted them. An older man stood in the doorway, his bearing formal, despite his obvious discomfort. Sarah recognized him from newspaper photos. Judge Thomas Patterson, Emma's father. Her father. I apologize for intruding, he said, his voice carefully modulated. Emma told me about the situation. I wanted to. That is, I thought I should. You thought you should finally acknowledge your daughter existed? Sarah's voice was sharper than intended, weeks of exhaustion and trauma finally finding a target. Judge Patterson's face flushed, but he didn't retreat. Yes. Exactly that. 34 years too late. But yes. The silence stretched until William made a small sound, drawing everyone's attention. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but alert, before closing again. Something about that tiny gesture, that proof of life persisting despite everything, shifted the energy in the room. He looks like you, Judge Patterson said quietly to Sarah, around the eyes. Your mother sent me a photo once, when you were born. You had that same expression like you were already planning your next move. She never told me about you, Sarah said. Not really. Just that my father was someone who'd chosen his other life. She was protecting you, Patterson said. From disappointment. From a man who lacked the courage to do right by her. By you. He paused, gathering himself. I'm retiring next month. My wife passed 2 years ago. Emma's the only family I have left, or so I thought until she told me about you. I'm not asking for forgiveness or a relationship. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And if you need anything legal help, financial support, anything, I'm here. Sarah studied him. This stranger who shared her blood, who'd given Emma the life that should have been partly hers. But looking at Emma, who'd chosen to stand beside her when she had no obligation, Sarah realized that family wasn't about what should have been, but what you chose to build from what was. The criminal trial of Richard Mitchell began 6 months later in a media circus that rivaled any celebrity scandal. William was sitting up by then, his early arrivals seemingly forgotten in his rush to meet every milestone. Sarah entered the courthouse through a different door than she had that terrible day, flanked by Emma and Rebecca, her head high despite the photographers shouting questions. Madison Cross had already pled guilty to assault in exchange for testifying against Richard. She sat in the witness box looking diminished, her platinum hair grown out to reveal dark roots, her designer clothes replaced with a conservative suit that didn't quite fit. But when she spoke, her voice carried the vindictive clarity of a woman with nothing left to lose. "He told me about Catherine while we were in bed," she said, her eyes fixed on Richard. "He said she'd threatened to expose his offshore accounts during their divorce. He said he'd replaced her antidepressants with something stronger, increased the dose gradually until she didn't know what she was taking." The prosecutor, Janet Morrison, was methodical in her questioning. "Did he express remorse?" Madison laughed bitterly. "He said it was Darwinian. That weak people invited their own destruction. He said Sarah would be easier because she was already broken." Sarah forced herself to remain composed, though Emma's hand on her arm tightened with each revelation. Behind them, the gallery was packed with reporters and women who'd reached out after the story broke other victims of men like Richard, survivors who'd found their voices in Sarah's story. Richard's defense was predictable. Madison was a scorned woman, lying for revenge. But then the recordings were played. Madison had been smarter than anyone gave her credit for, recording conversations over months, building an insurance policy she'd never expected to need. Richard's voice filled the courtroom, casual in its cruelty. "Catherine thought she could threaten me. She learned otherwise. Sarah's smarter, she just runs to lawyers. But lawyers can be handled. Everyone has a price or a pressure point." When Sarah took the stand, she spoke not just for herself, but for Catherine, for the woman Richard had murdered, and the woman he'd tried to erase. She detailed the financial abuse, the gaslighting, the systematic destruction of her self-worth. She talked about finding the strength to leave not despite her pregnancy, but because of it. "He told me once that I was weak," Sarah said, looking directly at Richard for the first time since that day in court. "That weak women invited betrayal, but he was wrong. It takes strength to trust, to love, to believe in someone. It takes strength to survive when that trust is betrayed. And it takes the greatest strength of all to rebuild after someone tries to destroy you." Richard's composure finally shattered when the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts, conspiracy to commit murder. Murder in the second degree, financial fraud, tax evasion. The man who'd controlled everything couldn't control 12 strangers who saw him for what he was. As they led him away, he turned to look at Sarah one last time. She didn't look back. She was too busy thinking about William's future, about the foundation she planned to build, about the life that waited beyond this courtroom. The video of Madison slapping Sarah had been viewed millions of times before the trial ended. What started as shock content had transformed into something else, a rallying cry, a symbol of what women endured in family courts, in marriages, in systems designed to protect everyone but them. Sarah hadn't sought the attention, but Emma convinced her not to waste it. The Helen Parker Foundation launched on what would have been Helen's 65th birthday. The venue was modest, a community center in Queens rather than a Manhattan ballroom, but it was packed. Women's shelters sent representatives. Domestic violence advocates came from across the country. Survivors who'd reached out to Sarah during the trial stood together, no longer isolated in their experiences. Sarah stood at the podium, William balanced on her hip, his chubby hands playing with her necklace, a simple gold chain that had been her mother's. She'd written a speech, but looking at the faces before her, she set it aside. "My mother once told me that the hardest prison to escape is the one we build in our own minds," she began. "The walls made of shame, of fear, of the belief that we deserve what's happening to us. Richard didn't just control my finances or my movements. He controlled my perception of reality, made me doubt my own experiences, my own worth." The room was silent, everyone leaning forward, as if her words were a lifeline. The Helen Parker Foundation isn't just about providing legal aid or financial support, though we'll do both. It's about helping women rebuild their sense of self, their trust in their own judgment. It's about recognizing that leaving is not the end of the journey, but the beginning. Emma spoke next, outlining the Foundation's legal aid program, the partnerships with financial institutions to help women establish independence, the counseling services that would address not just trauma but the practical challenges of starting over. Judge Patterson had donated the initial funding, a seven-figure sum that he called 34 years of interest on an unpaid debt. The media coverage was overwhelming. Sarah found herself on morning programs, in magazine profiles, her story retold through various lenses, sometimes accurately, sometimes sensationalized, always reduced to sound bites that couldn't capture the complexity of survival. But with each interview, more women reached out. Stories poured in from every state, every economic level, every walk of life. A senator's wife in Washington, who'd been institutionalized when she tried to leave. A teacher in Iowa whose husband had convinced everyone she was unstable. A CEO in Silicon Valley who'd signed away her company under duress. The patterns were consistent isolation, gaslighting, financial control, the gradual erosion of self that made leaving feel impossible, even when staying was unbearable. Sarah read every message, though Emma tried to protect her from the volume. She responded when she could, always with the same message. You are not alone. You are not crazy. You deserve better. Richard's attempts to control the narrative from prison failed spectacularly. His jailhouse interview, meant to garner sympathy, only revealed more of his narcissism. He claimed to be the real victim, persecuted by vindictive women and a biased system. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named Marcus Webb, let him talk until he'd thoroughly condemned himself with his own words. Madison, serving her sentence in minimum security, had become something of a cautionary tale herself. She gave her own interview, warning young women about men who seemed too good to be true, about the seductive power of being chosen by someone powerful. I thought I was special, she said. I thought I was different from Sarah, stronger, better. But I was just next in line. Through it all, William thrived. He was a happy baby, quick to laugh, reaching for everyone who came near. Sarah sometimes wondered if he'd absorbed her determination in the womb, if surviving that violent entry into the world had made him fearless. Emma doted on him, as did Judge Patterson, who'd become Grandpa Tom despite Sarah's initial reservations. The foundation grew beyond what Sarah had imagined. Corporate sponsors emerged, drawn by the positive publicity and genuine impact. A tech company donated a secure communication platform for women planning their escapes. A bank created a special program for financial independence. Law firms offered pro bono hours, but it was the individual donations that moved Sarah. Most $5 from a survivor in Detroit, $20 from a woman who'd helped her sister leave, $1,000 from someone signed only Catherine's friend. Each contribution was a thread in a web of support that hadn't existed when Sarah had needed it most. The garden party was Emma's idea, a celebration of William's first birthday and the foundation's success, but mostly an excuse to gather the family they'd built from fragments. Judge Patterson's estate in Westchester provided the setting, its grounds awakening from winter into tentative spring. Sarah watched William toddle across the grass, his steps uncertain but determined. Emma hovering nearby, ready to catch him if he fell. The parallels weren't lost on her, this child learning to walk, herself learning to trust, all of them navigating new terrain with cautious optimism. Rebecca arrived with her partner Diana, both women having become friends beyond their professional relationship. Dr. Holbrook brought her teenage daughter, who'd started volunteering at the foundation. Other survivors from the support groups came with their children, the garden filling with the sound of healing and progress. Your mother would be proud, Judge Patterson said, appearing beside Sarah with 2 glasses of lemonade. They'd developed an easier relationship over the months, built on shared concern for William and mutual respect, rather than trying to reconstruct a father-daughter bond that had never existed. She warned me about Richard, Sarah said. I thought she was being overprotective, old-fashioned. I should have listened. We all should have listened more, Patterson replied. To the women in our lives, to our consciences, to the voice that tells us when we're choosing comfort over courage. Emma called out from across the garden where William had discovered a butterfly, his delighted squeals drawing everyone's attention. Sarah moved toward them, feeling the sun on her face, the solid ground beneath her feet. She thought about Richard in his cell, about Madison serving her time, about Catherine who'd never gotten the chance to rebuild. But mostly she thought about tomorrow. Next month. Next year, time stretching ahead full of possibility rather than dread. "Mama!" William called, his new favorite word, and Sarah scooped him up, spinning him in a circle that made him laugh. Around them, the garden bloomed with unexpected beauty, flowers growing from soil that had been frozen all winter, life insisting on itself despite everything that had tried to stop it. "You know what I've learned?" Sarah said to Emma, who joined them, William reaching for his aunt with grabby hands. "Rock bottom isn't the end of the story, it's the foundation. Everything built on lies eventually collapses. But what you build on truth, on survival, on the choice to keep going when everything tells you to stop, that lasts." Emma took William, bouncing him on her hip while he played with her hair. Very philosophical for a birthday party. "It's his birthday," Sarah said, watching her son explore the world with fearless curiosity. "He was born from violence into love. If that's not philosophy, I don't know what is." The afternoon wore on with the lazy pleasure of people who'd earned their peace. No one mentioned the trials, the media attention, the ongoing legal battles with Richard's hidden assets. Today was for celebrating survival, for acknowledging that they'd all been broken in different ways and chosen to heal together rather than alone. As the sun began to set, Sarah stood to speak. Not a prepared speech, but words that came from someplace deeper than planning. "A year ago, I was on a courtroom floor, terrified I was losing everything. I did lose everything. Everything that was built on lies. Everything that was keeping me trapped. But in that loss, I found all of you. I found my sister, my father, my chosen family. I found my voice and my purpose." She looked at William, now drowsy in Emma's arms. "My son entered this world through chaos, but he's known nothing but love since that moment. That's what the foundation is about, not just helping women leave, but ensuring that what comes after is worth the courage it takes to go." The gathering continued past sunset, lights stringing across the garden like stars pulled down to earth. Sarah found herself standing alone for a moment, looking up at the actual stars beginning to emerge. She thought of her mother, of the secrets Helen had carried to protect her, of the strength that had been passed down through generations of women who'd survived things they shouldn't have had to face. "Thank you," she whispered to the sky, to Helen, to the universe that had somehow led her through the darkness to this moment of grace. 5 years had passed since the day Madison's palm had changed everything. The Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendur Hall glowed with warm light as 500 guests gathered for the Helen Parker Foundation's annual gala. Sarah stood at the entrance, greeting arrivals with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to navigate public life without losing herself to it. William, now 6, wore a miniature tuxedo with the confidence of a boy who'd grown up surrounded by strong women. He stood beside his mother, shaking hands with serious concentration, occasionally breaking into the grin that reminded everyone he was still a child, despite his premature gravitas. "Mom, is that the mayor?" he whispered, eyes wide. "It is," Sarah confirmed, smoothing his hair. "Remember what we practiced? Firm handshake, eye contact. Say thank you for coming," William recited, then added, "Can I tell him about my science project?" "Maybe later, sweetheart." Emma arrived in a stunning emerald gown, her usual severe style softened for the occasion. She'd left her law practice 2 years ago to run the Foundation's legal division full-time, helping over 3,000 women navigate divorce proceedings, custody battles, and criminal cases against their abusers. "The Times is here," Emma murmured to Sarah. "They want a quote about Richard's latest appeal being denied." Sarah's expression didn't change. Tonight isn't about him. It never is anymore. Richard Mitchell remained in prison, his appeals exhausted, his fortune liquidated to pay restitution to Catherine's family and support the Foundation. He'd become a footnote in Sarah's story rather than its center, a cautionary tale she rarely thought about, except when legal documents required her attention. Madison had been released after 3 years, disappearing into obscurity under a new name. She'd sent one letter to Sarah, not asking for forgiveness but offering a warning. There are more Richards out there. More women like I was. Keep fighting. Judge Patterson arrived with his new partner, Margaret Chen, a retired professor who'd helped him find happiness in his final act. He kissed Sarah's cheek, then knelt to William's level. "How's my grandson?" "Good, Grandpa Tom." "Mom says I can give part of the speech tonight." The hall filled with survivors and supporters, politicians and philanthropists, but also ordinary people who'd contributed what they could to something they believed in. Sarah recognized many faces, women who'd once sat crying in support groups, now standing tall, rebuilding their lives one day at a time. The program began with a video montage of the foundation's work. Safe houses in 12 states. Legal aid that had won custody for hundreds of mothers. Financial literacy, programs that had helped women achieve independence. Counseling services that addressed not just trauma, but the practical challenges of starting over. The camera panned over faces of women and children who'd found safety, dignity, hope. When Sarah took the stage, the room fell silent. She'd become a powerful speaker over the years, learning to channel her pain into purpose, her story into action. But tonight, she had a different message. "5 years ago, I thought strength meant enduring alone," she began. "I thought survival was about becoming hard enough that nothing could hurt you. But I've learned that real strength is in connection, in vulnerability, in the courage to trust again after trust has been shattered." She talked about the women who'd taught her resilience, the children who'd shown her joy was possible after trauma, the community that had formed around shared pain and mutual support. She spoke of her mother, whose portrait hung behind her, whose legacy lived not just in the foundation's name, but in every woman who found the courage to leave. "Tonight, I want to introduce someone special," Sarah said, gesturing to William. He walked to the podium with careful steps, standing on the box they'd placed there so he could reach the microphone. "My name is William Mitchell Parker," he said, his young voice clear and strong. "My mom is the bravest person I know. She says I saved her life by being born, but I think she saved mine by being my mom. This foundation helps other kids have safe homes with their moms. That's important, because every kid deserves to feel safe." The room erupted in applause, many wiping away tears. William beamed, then leaned into the microphone again. "Also, we raised $8 million tonight, which is enough to build 3 new safe houses." Sarah laughed, pulling him into a hug as the crowd rose to their feet. This was what victory looked like, not the destruction of those who'd hurt them, but the construction of something beautiful from the ruins. Later, as the gala wound down, Sarah found herself on the museum's rooftop garden, the city spreading below in a tapestry of lights. Emma joined her, along with Dr. Holbrook, Rebecca, and others who'd been there from the beginning. "Helen would have loved this," Emma said softly. "She's here," Sarah replied with certainty. "In every woman who finds her voice, in every child who grows up without fear. In this impossible family we've built." William appeared, tired but happy, reaching for his mother. Sarah lifted him, feeling his weight, substantial now, no longer the fragile infant who'd fought for each breath. He pointed at the sky where a shooting star blazed across the darkness. "Make a wish, Mom," he said sleepily. Sarah held him close, surrounded by chosen family, thinking of all the women still trapped, still fighting, still hoping. She thought of her mother's journals, discovered years after her death, filled with wishes for a daughter she'd raised alone but never abandoned. She thought of Catherine, whose justice had finally been served. She thought of herself, that terrified woman on a courtroom floor, not knowing that rock bottom would become the foundation for something extraordinary. "I wish," Sarah whispered to the night, to Helen, to the universe that had broken and rebuilt her, "that every woman finds her way to freedom, whatever that looks like for her." The star disappeared beyond the horizon, but its light seemed to linger, a promise written across the darkness. Below them, the city hummed with millions of stories, millions of struggles, millions of small victories against overwhelming odds. William had fallen asleep in her arms, trusting completely in his safety. Sarah kissed his forehead, then looked at the faces around her. Emma, fierce and loyal. Judge Patterson, finding redemption in his final years. Rebecca and Diana, who'd shown that love could exist without control. Dr. Holbrook, who'd delivered more than a baby that day. "This is just the beginning," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every word. "There are more women to help, more battles to fight, more families to rebuild. But tonight, let's just be grateful we found each other." They stood together in the garden above the city, this unlikely family forged in crisis and strengthened by choice. Somewhere, Richard sat in a cell, his empire reduced to concrete and regret. Somewhere, Madison was learning to live with her choices. Somewhere, women were planning their escapes, gathering courage, believing in tomorrow. But here, now, there was peace. William stirred in Sarah's arms, murmuring something about butterflies and birthdays. Sarah held him tighter, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet, the vast sky above, the infinite possibility that comes from surviving the unsurvivable and choosing to help others do the same. The night deepened around them, but they were not afraid of the dark. They had walked through worse and emerged into light. They had learned that breaking could be the beginning of becoming. They had discovered that the deepest wounds, when healed, could become the source of the greatest strength. "Mom," William said sleepily, "are you crying?" "Happy tears, baby," Sarah whispered. "The very best kind." And in that moment, with her son in her arms and her chosen family around her, Sarah Mitchell, survivor, warrior, mother, healer, knew that she had finally come home. Not to a place, but to a purpose. Not to safety, but to strength. Not to an ending, but to an endless beginning. Each day a choice to build something beautiful from the broken pieces. Each dawn a promise that what comes after can be greater than what came before.